Welcome to the Church and Culture Podcast, a weekly discussion with Dr. James Emery White on the latest trends happening in culture and where and how the church should respond. Jim is the founding and senior pastor of Mecklenburg Community Church in Charlotte, North Carolina, president of Serious Times, a ministry devoted to exploring the intersection of faith and culture, former professor of theology and culture at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, where he also served as their fourth president, and the author of more than 20 books. I am your host, Alexis Drye, and I can't wait to dive into this week's conversation. Awesome. Well, thank you all for joining us. If I were to ask you, listeners, what you think the fastest growing sport in America is, what do you think you'd guess? Well, if you proposed pickleball, you'd be correct. Invented in 1965, this combination of badminton and tennis and table tennis is estimated to be played by more than 48 million people nationwide. And no, there are no pickles involved, actually. But people of all ages are flocking to this sport, and plenty of businesses and athletic corporations are trying to capitalize on its popularity. But they're actually not the only ones. One news article I read recently mentioned that a growing number of churches want to tap into the benefits of pickleball with a side of spirituality. So, Jim, can you help us connect the dots a little bit between pickleball and spirituality? Or rather, what are churches hoping to use pickleball to accomplish?
Teach people not to swear when they screw up. No, we both ran across an article on this, and we found it interesting that we were swapping, and it really brought up the whole subject of the church and sports, which we haven't really talked about. But it's a good and important topic to explore because they are arguably the two areas of life where people have the most passion and the most interest. But to pickleball specifically, just so we can clear that up and move on, the appeal is threefold, I think. As I've observed it, and it's kind of exploded on the scene quickly. So I remember when I first heard about it, I just thought, gosh, I've never had that many people rave about it. But it's easy for anybody to play at any age and almost any level of physical ability. It's fun. And then third, it's a good way to interact with other people. I mean, it's a good, community thing. Churches are interested because they smell an opportunity. There's very few pickleball courts. They aren't very expensive to create at all. And so they feel like it might be a way of potentially reaching out to people by providing it or to create community for the people in their midst to give them a place to play. And you said, I had a figure of 20 million playing. You said 48 million. So it's increased since I last even heard that figure. So you can see the interest. Some have even called it a new third place, which we've talked about before on this podcast, meaning a place outside of work and home, a third place to hang out, kind of like a pub in the UK or Starbucks here in the United States. But in terms of outreach, the idea is that people will be drawn to being able to play pickleball on your physical campus in some way. And then when they're there, they'll interact with people who might be a part of the church. And then from that might be a gateway into faith. At least that's the plan.
Okay. Well, I'm going to come back to that in a second. But first, in thinking about pickleball it's relatively new, but the relationship between churches and sports is anything but new. And I always appreciate on the podcast when you have a chance to give us a succinct history lesson on a particular topic. And so would you mind talking a little bit about the church's relationship with sports and how that has evolved over time?
Yeah. It's interesting when a lot of people don't know that a lot of sports have a deeply Christian origin. The thing that comes to my mind right off the bat is basketball. Basketball was invented in 1891 by a Christian man, James Naismith. He was working at a Christian college, and it was the YMCA International Training School. And so that was the origin of basketball. There's not time to give a full, obviously, even cursory overview of the interaction of church and sport. But here's a couple of things with dynamics that I think are important. The earliest interplay actually was the Apostle Paul. His rather frequent use of sports analogies in his writings in the New Testament, mostly from the Olympic Games and specifically things like wrestling and boxing. I mean, they pop up a lot in his writings. He liked that as an analogy and as a metaphor. In his mind, there was a clear parallel between the disciplines of sports and the discipline of following Jesus and what it meant to follow Jesus. There really isn't a whole lot to say about the church and sports. Again, a lot of times it was just seen as frivolous and even of the world, and you didn't have anything to do with them, and for long periods of time. But there really isn't a lot to say till you really get to about the 18th and 19th century. I would say particularly the mid-19th century, when you had movements that emphasized the more physical and muscular aspects of faith. And it was this movement to kind of make, Jesus a he-man, and Christian men, kind of make it a muscular faith, essentially, combining faith and philanthropic service and sport. In the UK, this played itself out. Again, a lot of people don't know this, but you had several of the Premier League football teams. We would call it soccer, but their Premier League football teams their clubs were started in churches. And then, of course, you have the launch of the Young Men's Christian Association, better known as the YMCA, or just the Y. That was where basketball got its start, and that was in the mid-1800s as well. In terms of churches proper, I would say that it took off following World War II. In terms of churches getting more actively involved with it, particularly with a church or denominational sponsored rec leagues and churches building gyms or family life centers on their property. These were often multi-purpose buildings that could be a gym for at certain times, or a gathering place for a banquet, or even a service at other times. You also can't overlook the influence and impact of Billy Graham, and how he really did something that was novel. Did a lot of things that were novel, but one of them that now is commonplace. But he started to use sports heroes as giving testimonies. Christian sports heroes give testimonies, and that capitalized on sports interest. But it also kind of baptized sports in the minds of many people and linked it with the church and the Christian faith. And then that led to groups like the Fellowship of Christian Athletes, the FCA. It led to AIA, Athletes in Action. SCA was started in the 50s. Athletes in Action was started in the 60s. So you can see that was kind of parallel with Graham's efforts. But those are parachurch organizations. But still, they were kissing cousins. And we'll put a couple of overviews that are more in depth in the show notes, some links to it. But now, I would say right now, fewer churches are putting resources into this. Fewer churches are involved in putting things on. And there's a lot of reasons for that we can get into, like determining that it really wasn't that strategic to the mission, but we can talk about that. But really, one of the reasons is because sports, particularly youth sports, has become a business. I mean, it's just a machine. And it's an organized professional system, and it's just, and churches, we're not prepared or wanting to get into it at that level.
It's interesting that when we consider the current cultural moment that we're in, and particularly some of the things that we've even talked about on the podcast, which we can link to, things like, this current epidemic of loneliness, a desire that people have for religious experience. We even talked about men looking for manly expressions of Christianity. When you put all those things on the table, I can see why it makes sense that a church might want to get involved with sports. But you started to hint that maybe that there might be some risks of that partnership. Will you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, and I think that's exactly a perfect segue. It's so interesting how when churches catch wind of something, some of them, they just almost just go willy-nilly with their strategy. Like, oh, we need to reach men. Men want companionship, and they want to be manly. Okay, well, let's have a whiskey and cigar night, and we'll reach people for Jesus. Well, okay, I'm not putting down whiskeys and cigars, but is that really how you're going to reach? Is that real? I mean, are you thinking this through as the best way to do it and the best use of resources? So I don't know if I'd use the word risk as much as the need for strategic evaluation. And I'm pretty ruthless about this, as you know, when it comes to church strategy and asking the questions and having no sacred cows in the process. So let me just use a business analogy. Dunkin' Donuts recently made what I would consider a very astute move. They dropped the name Donuts from their name. They just became Dunkin'. And the reason was very simple. They're not in the donut business. They're not only in the donut business. In fact, most of their business comes from beverages. And by dropping donuts from their name, they're able to actually be more beverage-led in terms of their emphasis. And in just being Dunkin', they also leave their pivot foot in place. We'll use lots of sports analogies in this one. But they'll leave their pivot foot in place if and when they aren't beverage led anymore, because there's no guarantee that's going to be what's going to be the case in 10 years. They don't know what the future is going to hold. Right now, most of their sales are beverages. In 10 years, it could be bagels. I mean, they don't know. They're not alone in following this kind of thinking, back in, what was it, 2010, 2011, or somewhere around in there. Starbucks dropped coffee from their name, and they just became Starbucks. Weight Watchers in recent years went from Weight Watchers to just being WW. They wanted to take Weight Watchers out of it and just brand it with that logo, because they wanted to focus on a lot more than just dieting. They wanted to be on health and wellness and have that kind of a broad platform. I think this is really smart. I think this is a good thing to do. You need to know what business you're in and really know it, not narrow it, but really have a clear understanding of it, so you know what all falls under it and what doesn't. I think you've heard me use this historical lesson before. I think it's an important one, and it applies to this situation. It was in the late 1800s. There was no business that matched the financial and political dominance of the railroad. There's just no way to overestimate it. Trains ruled the transportation industry of the United States. It moved people and goods throughout the entire country. Well, then a new discovery came along, new development, the car, the automobile. But incredibly, the leaders of the railroad industry did not take advantage of their absolute unique dominant position to participate in this transportation revolution, this transportation development. The automotive revolution was happening all around them, and they did not use their industry dominance to take hold of the opportunity. And here's why. The railroad barons didn't understand what business they were in. They thought they were in the train business. They weren't in the train business. They were in the transportation business. There is a difference. And time passed them by, as did the opportunity, and they couldn't see what their real purpose was. So if Dunkin' isn't in the donut business, but the food and beverage business, if Weight Watchers isn't in the diet business, but in the health and wellness business, all right, let's play this out. What about the church? Okay, well, let me state what I hope is obvious. You're not in the Sunday school business. You're not in the Awana business, the Upward Sports business, the men's fraternity business, the Catalyst business, or any other programmatic business. Let's go further. You're not in the small group business. You're not in the men's ministry business or the women's ministry business or any other sub-ministry business. All of these may be well and good and helpful, but they are not your business, and they should not be treated as such. You're in the business of evangelizing the lost, assimilating the evangelized, discipling the assimilated, and then unleashing the discipled. Been that way for 2,000 years. So something like sports ministry, or organizing a church-based sports league, or sponsoring a church softball team, or using your campus or your building for sports and recreation, or even building sports fields on your campus, it's got to be evaluated in light of your purpose and your mission and your limited resources and time and staffing, and whether it's the most strategic way to pursue your purpose and your mission. The risk, if you will, is that a church will simply do sports because sports are popular or people like sports, and they won't really think about it. And even if they do offer something and it has success in numbers, let's say it's very successful, do you really evaluate the mission? And are you looking at it that way? And so, yes, it can be a community service, but my goodness, 1,000 things can be a community service. Offering a church offering a school, a church offering daycare. I mean, these are all things. And I don't know of a single church that started, for example, either one of those that didn't regret it. They just wish they had never done it. It just becomes the tail that wags the dog. And they have very little to show for it in terms of mission. I used to get bugged all the time. I think people stopped asking me this because I think rumors of my answer were coming out. But I used to get bugged all the time about, why doesn't MEC start a school? And, there was a part of me that would always say, shoot me now. I mean, God, what a nightmare that would be. But they said, but they would actually get mad at us for not having a school because they had a school need. And they didn't want to homeschool. There wasn't a Christian school around. They didn't like public school. So, all right, MEC, you need to solve my school problem. Well, we're not in the school business. And, and gratefully so. I'm not saying can't be a ministry, but it was never our calling. Um, and the same thing with daycare. And I'd have never met a church that said, "Oh, we're so glad we have daycare." I mean, they started, it's like they can't stop it, or they become financially dependent on it, even though it's not that big of a stream of revenue. But what happens is that the resources of the school, of the church, are used throughout the week. You're not able to do any kind of other ministry. It just takes over everything. And then it's almost impossible to convert it to really good ministry on the weekends for children. So it still has that school vibe, which isn't particularly appealing to kids. And so then all of a sudden, this daycare you have is affecting your weekend ministry and outreach. And so, that's what I mean by the tail wagging the dog. It's like we need to be strategic in our thinking about that. So, you can start these things in the name of reaching the unchurched, but you got to ask yourself, okay, is that really working? Is that what's best? If not, you're just running a daycare, and the church is not in the daycare business. And so it's the same with sports. And I would get asked in years past, hey, fund our softball team. Why? I mean, because we might reach a non-Christian or two, or we might have a non-Christian or two on our team. I said, and it would be like thousands of dollars to sponsor the softball team. And I say, so do you realize that if you're saying we might have a non-Christian or two that we could reach for X number of dollars, what if I took that money where I know I could reach 50 unchurched people? I mean, basically what it came down to is they wanted us to they liked softball. They wanted us to pay for it. It really wasn't strategic missionally at all. And you got to look at this in all kinds of ways. I'm on a rip here, but I don't care. There was a guy, I was talking a guy recently, and I'm not at all, this wasn't bad intentioned, but they had taken like 100 people and spent an entire Saturday morning cold called knocking on doors in the hopes of sharing Jesus. It's a great thing. I mean, it was a very well-intentioned thing. And they had like 3 people out of all those homes they knocked on, all those volunteer hours, all that effort. They had like maybe 3 people maybe express an interest in maybe attending. It didn't reach much, but they were celebrating. We got 3. And everything within me was thinking, if you take those 100 volunteers and the 4 hours they spent, that's 400 volunteer hours. I would almost bet my right arm I could invest 400 volunteer hours with a lot more than just a 3-person interest response. So that's what I mean by being strategic. I'm not trying to be cold-hearted or trying to denigrate people's motives. I'm just saying we just have got to be strategic with these things. And I don't know how strategic churches have been in thinking about sports. Doesn't mean you can't have a sports ministry. Doesn't mean there's not some good parachurch Christian organizations, or that really helps encourage Christians in sports, or even tries to have outreach to sports organizations. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the church and its role as a sponsor and involvement. And I don't know that there's a lot of strategic thinking there.
Another interesting layer, though, to this conversation is that even if a church decides that they don't want to engage in sports ministry directly, it does seem inevitable that they will butt up against sports, because in addition to things like Sunday afternoon football games and, as you mentioned, youth sports and how dominant they are in parents' lives, it's hard not to have a conversation about sports. Can you riff on that a bit more?
I was actually interviewed by the New York Times on this a few years back. We'll put that link in the show notes too. But what happened, and I'd written a blog about parent sports in the church, and it got a little noticed, even crossing the desk of the New York Times. So I got a call from a reporter, and they wanted to do a story on this was a cultural phenomenon. Here's the essence of what I said to them then, and I stand by it now. And the essence of what that blog was about. I love sports. I love sports. I believe that on the 8th day, God created ESPN, and if he didn't, he should have. I played organized sports from grade school all the way through to college. All 4 of my children were involved in sports during their formative years, from basketball to soccer to football, swim team, gymnastics, and such. I coached as a basketball coach. as a basketball coach many years. When my boys were playing basketball, I was their primary coach in various leagues, and even one of my jobs when I was in graduate school was coaching a Catholic high school team. I believe sports are an absolutely good and healthy investment for parents to make, even when it involves some level of sacrifice, selflessness, to have their kids be involved. Here's the inevitable but that is coming in all of that. There was a study published in the Review of Religious Research that examined declining attendance at 16 congregations. I think we can put this in the show notes too. It's a little old, but it was an interesting study. And what it found was that the leaders of those declining congregations, almost all, had part of the concern for their decline, or the correlation of their decline, with children's sports activities. Because it was increasingly both of these practices and competitions, or the practices and competitions, were increasingly scheduled on traditional church times, like Sunday mornings. And I remember at the time when I read that, anecdotally feeling the same thing. We weren't in decline. It wasn't affecting our growth, but I was hearing stories and hearing chatter and noise in the system that I found very disturbing. And I remember I even weaved it into a talk one weekend, and I still will from time to time when it's relevant and we're dealing with parent and family and faith issues, because it's a thing. Here's what I was seeing. I was seeing parents letting almost every other extracurricular activity in their child's life take precedent over investments designed to make a spiritual impression. Meaning soccer or baseball or swim team, that got first dibs in the calendar. I mean, that was just put in without thinking. And then, church would get the scraps, if anything, of what was left over on the schedule. I remember when this is on my mind because we're getting ready to have another family night actually this week here at Mac. Family night at our church is a really fun thing that we do periodically. It's designed for the entire family to attend together and highlights a specific character trait through a program involving music and drama and dance and skits and video and more. It's just crazy, chaotic. Kids love it. And it's fantastic for parents to, teach their children things, and they're equipped to go further with that with their child in their home. And then it also coordinates with the Met Kids program on the weekend. Anyway, it's a fantastic thing. It's so popular we have to ticket it. We can't even just open the doors for it. Free tickets, but I mean, you have to have a ticket. It's one of the more popular events in the life of our church, and combined with Met Kids, our program for kids birth through fifth grade, it's reached thousands of people and their children, and strategically serves parents' efforts to build Christ-like character and to not to mention a relationship with Jesus himself into their child's life. But I would overhear parents say things like, "Oh yeah, we're gonna do family night. Wouldn't miss it for the world until soccer starts." Or, "We're doing Met Kids on weekends. Oh, it's amazing. Our kids love it. They're learning so much about Jesus, but of course we won't be able to do that when swim team starts." And that's a concern. I mean, let's just say it. I don't care if it's popular or not. And it isn't about our church. It's not about, attendance kinds of things. This is me talking parent to parent, dad to dad, and pastor to people. Because think about what you're saying. I remember I said this once in a talk. I can't remember whether it was in the blog or not, but I said, I want you to just stand in front of a mirror, and I want you to say a sentence out loud. Look yourself in the eye and say this sentence out loud. I want you to hear yourself say it, see yourself say it, and then you can just tell me how it feels. And here's the sentence: I will do spiritual things for my child's sake until sports conflict, and then sports win. Now I want you to say it out loud, looking yourself in the face, and tell me if you blush. I mean, do we mean that? Really? Is that how we want to prioritize things? And I mean, I get socialization. I get parents, the temptation to live vicariously through your child as if somehow they're going to be the next Tom Brady or Pele or Michael Jordan, or you think that this is the ticket to a scholarship, when the fact of the matter is 99.9% of the kids, that's not going to be true. It's going to be a childhood that comes and goes, and that childhood is going to have held what it held. And if you made sports everything and Jesus nothing, then you're going to live with that, and that child's going to live with that the rest of their life. When our kids were younger, Susan and I saw this one coming. We really did. We wanted our kids in those events as much as everyone else, but with some of those sports, there just kept being conflict after conflict after conflict. So I remember when we decided, okay, we're just going to have to take a stand. This is going to have to be a parental stand, a parental decision, a value that we're going to have to follow. So for every team, every league, we'd put, when you register, a lot of times you have the option to say, well, what nights can you do things, and when can or evaluate leagues by when they do things and stuff. So we would always either put down when we registered or look for the right sport or the right league that would ensure that it was not going to affect Sunday mornings. And for us back then, it also included Wednesday night. And we really wanted the periodic family nights to be absolutely prioritized. And we let the coaches know in advance, this is, and we would look for places where you could do that. And I'll tell you what, we had no regrets. I went through 4 kids, about a 20, what would that average out to be? About a 20-year parenting run of that, and no regrets and no frustrations and no, in all those years of parenting, we never had a kid penalized. We never had anyone kick us off a team. We never once felt that we deprived our kids of anything substantive. And even if we had, who cares? Who cares? That's not important. Their hearts were important. Their character was important. What they were gaining spiritually was paramount. That's what mattered. And they turned out fine. Valedictorians, athletes, prestige college acceptances, good marriages, all the things that parents are so insecure about that they think sports are going to deliver for some odd reason. But more important, all 4 know Christ intimately and are in, and that's the win. That's the win. I've seen too many parents make sports their priority as if that's what it means to raise their children in a healthy and holistic way. Like that is the biggest thing you could possibly do. And that's a new phenomenon culturally, quite frankly. Only to then see that child travel far from God during their high school or college years, or leave the faith altogether as a young adult. They had field hockey, they had basketball, they had swim team, but they didn't wind up with much of Jesus. And I want you, and again, hear my heart. It's not about choosing between Jesus and sports. At least it doesn't have to be. It wasn't for our family, but we had to prioritize Jesus over sports. There's a difference. And if it comes down to that choice, how exactly does soccer rank over your child's eternity? You're going to have to explain that one to me. How is it that we'll spend half a day traveling to a volleyball tournament, but fail to protect an hour on Sunday where they'll learn about God? Help me with that one. So let's just say I watch my sports scores carefully. I don't see those adding up to a win.
You may have just answered the last question I want to ask you, but I'm just going to ask it again, just in case you have something you want to add, particularly.
I'm kind of worked up. Okay. I might have something.
Well, because I was curious about, and this is kind of more broad than our conversation has been, but I wanted to know about the role that individual Christians let sports play in their lives.
All right. This is part of it, isn't it?
Yeah. And I imagine, again, you've been serving in ministry for so many years, and I'm sure you've come across this, of just the importance that Christians give sports in their lives, and particularly as it conflicts with faith.
Well, let's go ahead and say it. Parents are prioritizing sports over faith. Why? Because they do themselves. That sports have become their religion. It's become their faith. It's become their holy temple. I remember reading an article in the New York Times, and I'll get this to you for show notes, or reading an article in the New York Times about the soulful spiritual aspect of games has been elevated to our modern religious experience. That is the new religion. He called it America's great faith. Sports is now America's faith. It's not Christianity. It's sports. And that is what moves us the most. And it's this soulful spiritual nature of it. And we've given it that soulful spiritual nature, reverential nature. Sports moments have become our spiritual moments, our collective spirituality moments. There was a professor at the University of Southern California who described it this way. In fact, I brought this because I wanted to get it right, because I knew we were going to hopefully get onto this. This is what he wrote. He said, When you are seeing the greats play at their peak and bend the limits, it feels like a spiritual moment because you're being transported. You get so caught up in the moment, you're not thinking about your phone, your ego, or your job. It's just this great game in front of me, that great players and the drama of it all. It's much the same as people described standing in front of the burning bush, or the way being in a house of worship can take our breath away, or when we are looking at an incredible sunset. I mean, that's blatant. And I think he's right. I think that is the way it is for a lot of people. They aren't saying sport is better than religion, but it has become a form of religion. Stadiums are like cathedrals. Athletes are like gods. It reminds me of a scene from one of my favorite movies. Have you ever seen Remember the Titans?
Yeah.
Good for you. I was going to think, well, she probably hasn't because she doesn't get out much. But anyway, I'm good. Yay, Ryan, your husband. He probably introduced you. But it brings to mind a scene from that movie where Coach Boone, played by Denzel Washington, walks into this empty high school football field with a member of the school board, and they were in some conversation. He turns on the lights, and he just looks around and he says, oh, this is my sanctuary. This is it right here. All the hatred and turmoil swirling around us, but this is always right. Struggle, survival, victory, defeat. It's just a game, but I love it. This is my church. And that's the way a lot of people feel. And one reason is because it is akin to a spiritual experience. And we just so yearn for the real thing because we were made with a God-shaped hole. We so yearn for the real thing that we'll take any slice of transcendence we can give. And in a secular world, the place that's going to give us the most sense of transcendence outside of the real thing is probably a stadium, is probably a sport. And I liked how one pair of philosophers talked about it, that they said the whoosh of God has been replaced with another whoosh. You know, that sweeping feeling about how in our secular age, there's this sadness that we're not even aware of because the age is secular. There's no shared values. There's no sense of a God, no sense of being determined or created or any of those things. We have to find our own meaning. So what fills that God-shaped void? Sports. They look back at the emotion. One of the examples they gave in their book, it was called All Things Shining, was the name of the book. So it was a survey of Western philosophy. But one of the examples they gave was the emotion that swept through the crowd at Yankee Stadium when Lou Gehrig delivered his luckiest man alive speech, which you can actually still see on YouTube, black and white footage of that. During the magic times that sports offers, we can have these moments of intense elevation, spiritual transcendence. And I think a lot of people felt that with Michael Jordan. One of the things that made him transcend the game was that you felt something there. And even when it came out during COVID, that wonderful series on ESPN, The Last Dance, which was you just felt transported. A more contemporary example too might be like, I don't know if you remember the Super Bowl victory by the New Orleans Saints. I'm a Carolina Panthers fan, so that part wasn't fun. But when the New Orleans Saints won and Drew Brees held his child during the post-victory celebration, it was just, you have these moving moments, and they call the experience whooshing up. And of course, the sad thing is a lot of people feel that that's all that there ever can be spiritually. There is no ultimate whooshing up found in a single meaning of life, much less God. Instead, we've got to live for all the whooshes of life that are on the surface, such as the whoosh of a concert or a political rally. I remember when Taylor Swift was doing her thing, people felt it. They felt something spiritual, transcendent. It was like church. They felt part of something bigger than themselves. It was a musical concert. That's all it was. But that's how much we hunger for the real thing. And so the arena spirituality, whether it be concert or music or sport, is like the only spirituality available to us. And so we seize it for all that it's worth, and then it translates into how we raise our children, and it's all such a pale imitation of obviously the real thing and the role of God in our life. And you know, it again, it's these faint echoes of the real thing that so many times, I'm really diverging here, but so many times it's those faint echoes that of the real thing that we're searching for, that we hear, and we don't really know where it's coming from. Um, I know you've read "Surprised by Joy" by C.S. Lewis, and for him, the whoosh was joy, and he was always attracted to joy, and he would catch glimpses of it or hear echoes of it, and it absolutely captivated it for him. He found it in particular walks, or in books that he would read, or in music that he would hear, and he didn't realize that it was the longing for God. And that's why when he became a Christian, he titled his spiritual autobiography "Surprised by Joy," surprised that it was real, surprised that they weren't just faint echoes, but the real thing was there. Um, so, so yeah, when football season starts again, I'll be as happy as anybody, and I'll be in front of this flat screen TV and watching my beloved Panthers hopefully have a better season than they've had for the last 500 years. But but I'm going to remember the real whoosh in all those moments, and realize that whenever I feel it too, through sports, it's an echo from a distant land calling us home.
Mm. What a great word to end on. And prayerfully, the timeliness of this podcast will be helpful going into the summertime, when a lot of parents get a bit of a reprieve from sports, and just maybe a time afforded for reflection to kind of consider what role we're going to let sports play come fall. But thank you, Jim, for today's conversation. Thank you guys, as always, for listening, and we hope you'll join us again next week.